It's my pleasure to introduce Pedro Noguera as our keynote speaker, first keynote speaker to the conference. We really owe Pedro a great vote of thanks for squeezing us into his agenda. He left New York last Friday, US time, Saturday our time, moved his family across the country to Los Angeles and his daughter to start a new school, his wife a new job, and I'm not sure what sort of credit you managed to establish, Pedro, to allow you to come and join us, but we certainly are appreciative of the efforts you've made to be here in such a busy time of your life. Pedro is the Peter Agnew Professor of Education and the Executive Director of the Metropolitan Centre for Urban Education at New York University, and he's now taken up a tenure at UCLA in California. His research focuses on the ways in which schools are influenced by social and economic conditions, as well as by demographic trends in local and regional contexts. He's the author of 11 books, over 200 articles and monograms, serves on the boards of numerous national and local organisations, and is a regular commentator on educational issues on CNN and other news outlets. His advocacy for educational efforts aimed at fighting poverty has been acknowledged with numerous awards, and we're delighted to have him to speak with us about the role of leadership in building the capacity of schools to meet student needs. I'd like you to give a warm Australian and Tasmanian welcome to Pedro Noguera.
Good morning. It is such a privilege and pleasure to be here with you. I really understand now why this is called the Heart of Leadership, because this conference already appealed to our hearts and our bodies and minds, and I really thank you for the opportunity to be here with you. As you heard from Bob, this was not the best time for me to travel to Tasmania, but I couldn't resist when I got the invitation, because when else will I ever get to Tasmania? So I'm really excited to be here, despite the long lines at immigration and the long time sitting in my seat, because it's an opportunity for me to learn from you about the work you're doing and about the challenges facing schools in this country. I get to work throughout the world, actually, on education. I've spent time doing work in South Africa in the townships, outside of Port Elizabeth and Cape Town, in the Middle East, in places like Abu Dhabi and Dubai, in Latin America, the Caribbean, and then throughout the United States, Canada, and North America. And over again, what I see and what I realize is that education is implicated in many of the most serious problems facing the world today. I would say particularly issues related to poverty and inequality. Education's right there at the center, because increasingly those without education are those least likely to participate in the wealth and the abundance in the world. But it's also implicated in issues like health. The fact is that many of the health problems and challenges facing the world could be cured with better education and with better access to decent health care. And it's also implicated in issues like global warming, where educating people about the needs for sustainability and for alternatives to petroleum become so critical. At the same time, education is also implicated in the solutions to many of our problems. And it's for that reason that I find myself inspired about being in education, being in the field, and working with educators who are at the front lines of trying to figure out how to create schools that serve all children well, and schools that can play a role in creating a more just and sustainable world. And it's that work that continues to keep me motivated and willing to get on a plane to travel to Tasmania, because I find that it is in figuring out how to get educators to understand and to do this work and to resist the tendency to accept the conditions as they are, that genuine change becomes possible. And so I want to start by just saying how I appreciate, even last night, the visit to the museum, which disturbed me in my sleep many times last night. because not only was I stimulated and challenged by what I saw, I was at times deeply disturbed by what I saw and experienced at that museum, but I think education should do that for us. It should unsettle us. It should make us uncomfortable. It should challenge us. It should provoke us to question why things are the way they are. And unless education does that, education runs the tendency of merely reproducing the very problems that exist right now. And so while I believe in education, I also have to say I'm suspicious of education. I'm suspicious of education for the same reason that the Holocaust survivors ended up very suspicious of education following the Holocaust. There's a great poem, or a great letter, by a survivor written to a teacher following her rescue. And I'll paraphrase, she says, "Dear teacher, I am suspicious of education. I'm suspicious of education because the gas chambers were designed by well-trained engineers. And the doctors who tortured us were very well educated, as were the nurses. An education that is not grounded in morals and ethics produces more Eichmanns." So my endorsement of education is not unqualified. I have a lot of evidence, and I think many of you do too, that there are lots of well-educated, sick people in the world today. There are lots of people with high test scores who do terrible things and have very little in the way of conscience for what they do. And it's a reminder that education, if not grounded in ethics, if not grounded in moral values, is an education that can do terrible things. And so while I want to encourage us to think about how to do our work even more effectively than we have, I also want to encourage us to never lose sight of the fact that it's always about more than simply achievement. If our kids get high test scores but get strung out on drugs, we've still failed, haven't we? Education's got to be about preparing young people for life. And so I want to remind us that there are, in fact, two purposes of education. On the one hand, there is the great need we have to prepare young people for their roles in the world, to prepare them for college or university, prepare them for work, to make sure they have the knowledge and skills necessary so they can participate fully in our society. But that's not sufficient, because education's also got to provide them with the mindset, with the critical thinking ability, with the creativity to solve the problems that we will pass on to them. And we're passing them a lot, aren't we? A whole lot of problems which current knowledge is insufficient to solve. Otherwise, we'd have solved them, right? And in fact, unless we prepare our young people with the ability to think outside the box, with the ability to tap into their imagination, we run the risk of just preparing another generation to create more problems. And we know that one reaction to those problems is fear. Fear that these problems are so great that the most we can do is just not think about them. Better to distract ourselves with the popular culture, with Facebook, with the media, than to actually dwell on the huge challenges before us. The poet Rumi reminds us there's two types of knowledge. One type you get from books. The other type that comes from life experience and from tapping into your conscience. My father used to call that common sense. And he had no high school education. And he often reminded us that common sense really wasn't that common. And he also said there were a lot of well-educated fools. How do we make time for both? How do we make sure that our students are, in fact, well prepared, that they have, in fact, mastered these standards and are well educated and able to go to college and hold jobs? That is important. That is necessary. I'm a father of 5 children. I want them all to be employed. At the same time, I also want them to be happy and to lead fulfilling lives. I want them to be able to look and confront the problems facing the world and not be afraid. To draw upon their knowledge, their intellect, their experience, their creativity, their imagination, and come up with new ways of solving old problems. I want you to think for a moment about Ebola. I was reminded about Ebola when I entered Australia, and they asked me if I was carrying any and had I been to Africa recently. Think about this. Ebola, last September, was being described as a pandemic. It was projected that there would be 1 million carriers of Ebola across the world within 3 months. Today, Ebola is almost eliminated, including in the places where it started, in the Ivory Coast, in Guinea, in Liberia. And there is still no virus for Ebola. Doesn't exist. How did that happen? Well, at a time when others were responding with fear to the crisis, people like New Jersey Governor Chris Christie, who also would like to be president if he had his way, were quarantining health workers. Some health workers chose to go to the crisis. One of them was an epidemiologist who was actually Liberian himself, a Dr. Fala from MIT, who went to the very neighborhood that was the epicenter of the crisis in an area called West Point. That should be an inspiration for what's possible when we act on our hopes instead of our fears. My question to you as principals, as school leaders, is what are you doing to make sure there's time in the curriculum, there's time in the school year, in the school day, to develop those types of talents in our children? We spend so much time covering the curriculum, and in the United States, so much time testing the children, that we leave so little time for developing those capacities that all human beings have. And so my first question to you is, how are you going to make the space, the time, to provide the kind of education that will lead to a more just, less suffering in the world than we have now? I'm not simply an optimist. I'm a pragmatist. But I also believe that the possibilities for change are real, they're there, but they can only exist, they'll only be realized if we have the courage to confront them. And education can and must play a role in helping us to confront them. So I want to encourage you now to think about your work as leaders. And I want to point out that in education, as is true in many other fields where leadership is important, there's two types of leadership. There is the technical and the adaptive. The technical is important, especially in education, because it's a lot about compliance. Compliance with regulations, with procedures, with the law. Moreover, it's about managing large organizations, managing people, making sure they're certified, making sure that the schools run as they're supposed to, making sure the children are fed, that there's heat in the winter. I guess not much winter in Australia, but air conditioning. Occasionally winter in Tasmania. That the buses run on time, if there are buses. That the technical aspects of school, though, have nothing to do with whether or not children are inspired to learn, with whether or not they're engaged, with whether or not their teachers know how to build strong, positive relationships with them. That's the adaptive part of education. It's adaptive because it forces us to recognize that what worked before may not work now, because things change. The children change, the families change, the communities change, the needs change. We work in a constantly changing dynamic environment. If I told you 20 years ago that coffee would cost $4 or $5 a cup, and people would be lining up to buy it, you'd probably say you're crazy. Or that we'd be walking around with these very expensive phones, that we wanted people to stay in touch with us 24 hours a day. You say that makes no sense. Things change quickly. Education must change too. And that's the reason why leaders must be adaptive in their work. They must constantly reflect on the nature of the work and keep asking themselves, are we really able to meet the needs of the children we serve? And the only way you can answer that question is if you know the children you serve. And not just know them in terms of their backgrounds or their demographics, but actually know who they are as people, as individuals. Know their families. Know what life is like outside of school. Know what challenges they bring. Know about how they learn and what interests them. How many of you have ever seen a child learn to play a new video game? Is video games common here in Australia? Do they download a lecture first on the game? Or do they get on and start playing? And playing and learning through their mistakes, and maybe even asking for help from a friend. And some kids will even get on YouTube to learn the game. We call that cheating in education. They learn through their mistakes, they learn through collaboration, they learn through trial and error. And ultimately, when they stick with it, and usually they do when they like the game, they learn through mastery. They get to higher levels. Ask yourself now, how often do we give our children a chance to learn by doing as opposed to by listening? How often do our children get to learn through mistakes instead of having their mistakes used against them? How often do we give our children a chance to learn and experience mastery so they are able to do more advanced level work because they have a strong foundation? That kind of learning, that kind of activity requires an environment conducive to teaching and learning. Creating that environment is adaptive work. If you're still confused about the distinction, I want you to think about a marriage. How many of you are married? Lots of married people out there. My bet is that when you met the person you're married to, you didn't look at that person and say, you know what, I would like to pay bills with you for the rest of your life. That's not a great proposition, is it? But if you've been married for a while, the chances are you're paying a lot of bills and you're focused on managing a household and keeping it together. But you also know this, that if all you do is pay bills and all you do is manage that household and you don't make time for each other and you don't communicate and there's no romance, what happens to that marriage? It will eventually fall apart. That part is the adaptive work of the marriage. And like a marriage, schools can't simply be generic places where people show up because they have a job and they're fulfilling their job requirements and they're in compliance with policies. Those kinds of schools never succeed. Never succeed in breaking the cycle of poverty. Never succeed in tapping into the imagination of children. Never succeed in creating another generation who's not only ready to participate in a democracy, but ready to enliven and invigorate that democracy, because that kind of an education requires a different kind of an experience. And so my challenge to you, since you're focused on the heart of leadership, is to be adaptive leaders. Instructional leadership is always adaptive. It's adaptive because it doesn't happen in your office. It happens in classrooms. It requires a high level of social and emotional intelligence because you've got to figure out how to work with your teachers, how to support them, how to coach them, how to give feedback, critical feedback sometimes, how to build trust so that when problems occur, we can talk them through without incrimination and without defensiveness. Instructional leadership, school culture, building partnerships with parents, all is a form of adaptive leadership. And because it's adaptive, it forces us to think and reflect on what we're doing. And so I want to spend the next several minutes with you thinking about how to do this adaptive work. And I want to do it with the knowledge in mind that we are faced with a huge dilemma in education. And this is a global problem, not a US problem, not an Australian problem, it's a global problem, except in a couple places. The problem is this: all the evidence shows that the children with the most privilege will do the best academically. That's what's really driving the outcomes of our children is their backgrounds, the education level of the parents, the income of the family. And therefore, rather than schools being a place that produces greater equity in society, schools are the place where inequity gets reproduced. I want you to think about your school, your children, your data, and ask yourself whether or not it is true there. To what degree are the backgrounds of your children driving the outcomes? How common is it to find poor children accelerating, performing at high levels? If the answer is not very common, then you have a problem on your hands. Because rather than education at your school being used to make a difference, education at your school is reproducing the status quo. And I want to acknowledge that reproducing the status quo was easy. Because everything in our societies is premised on inequity. Wealth is unevenly distributed. Power unevenly distributed. So why should we think it would be easy to create schools that counter those tendencies? It's not easy. It's hard. It requires, again, the ability to reflect, to disrupt, to interrupt the way we do things. I want to encourage you to ask yourself this question: is your school merely reproducing inequity? And if the answer is yes, then you've got a lot of work to do. Because we have clear, compelling evidence that there is talent in the trailer parks. You have trailer parks here in Australia? Where poor people live? Similar. Housing tenements. Aboriginal communities. There's talent out there. Our job in education is to cultivate talent in children, not merely to measure and sort. Measuring and sorting is the way we've traditionally done things in education. Children come to us and we make decisions about their ability, about their potential, and then we sort them accordingly. Right? Those we think are gifted, place them in one group. Those with fewer gifts, or whose gifts are more latent, put them in other groups. I'm not sure how you do in Australia, but in the United States we do that very, very early in reading groups. Ray Riss did a study of schools in Chicago called the Urban School of Factory for Failure. Followed schools in kindergarten. And he was struck how on the first day of school the teacher was making judgments about where to place children, which tables. And he noticed that the children who came in dressed neatly and who looked well prepared for school were seated right up front, and those with the runny noses, with lint in their hair, urine smell, seated in the back. And lo and behold, these groups became the reading groups. And as he followed these groups over time, what he followed is that those who started in the back stayed in the back. Very little movement in between. Now, it may not be that direct, it may not be that explicit in your schools. Hopefully not. Because what we know in many schools is we're not only sorting children, we're also sorting the teachers. Who teaches your most advanced students? In many schools, it's the most advanced teachers. Which teachers are teaching the most disadvantaged children? In many schools, it's the least prepared, the least effective. You know, sometimes I go to schools and the educators tell me, you know, we're really good with kids who are motivated, with kids who come from families that value education. We're great with those kids. Just not so good with the other kids. Suppose I tell you there was a doctor who's only good if you are healthy already. Right? It's probably not the doctor you want, right, when you get sick. Because the way we judge doctors, the way we judge hospitals, is not how good are you with those who need the least help, but how much of a difference do you make for people who actually need help. As educators, we have to believe that when our parents trust us enough to send us their children, that we can make a difference with their children, that we can help to cultivate their talents. You know, here's the thing. If they've got talent in athletics, they have a good chance of having those talents identified, don't they? Especially if they're real tall or very large. In the United States, we can find football players anywhere. There's a little town in Florida called Belle Glade. Belle Glade is right outside of West Palm Beach. It's a dirt-poor place. Most people don't have indoor plumbing. The roads are not paved. High illiteracy, high unemployment. It's produced more professional football players than any community in the United States for the last 20 years. People say because the grass is so high, the children learn to run fast. I say it's because we love football more than we do care about education. If it was our priority, we could produce engineers from Belle Glade, and scientists, and writers, and artists. Not our priority. And I see lots of evidence, at least in the United States, maybe it's not true in Australia. You've heard about Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. And you might remember that after the hurricane, the disaster, it wasn't the disaster that actually created the crisis, it was the levees breaking that created the crisis. And people were being called refugees as they were brought into the Superdome, the home of the Saints, the football team from that city. And so the Saints couldn't play because it was housing hundreds of people who were evacuated from their homes. Barbara Bush, the president's mother, said at the time she had no idea that people live like that in America. Well, 9 months after the disaster, the Saints were in the Super Bowl. 9 months later. Super Bowl was up and running. Saints were winning games. Meanwhile, there were still no schools opened in the lower Ninth Ward. We love football more than we do children in the United States. Now, I don't know if that's true in Australia. My hope is that you're not following that example, that you're really investing in children regardless of their backgrounds, that you can't go to a community and tell based upon the demographics of the community what kind of education kids get because that's what's not dictating policy. I hope so. But the evidence shows that in many parts of the world it is. And again, I've said I've traveled throughout the world. And the only places where I see exceptions are in Scandinavia, particularly Finland, and Cuba. Little Cuba. You know, Fidel Castro said not long ago, he said, the biggest challenges of the revolution were breakfast, lunch, and dinner. The biggest accomplishments, education, health, and sports. They know how to educate people in Cuba. That's not their problem. Little Barbados, my family's from the Caribbean. I get to spend a lot of time in the Caribbean. Little Barbados has a higher adult literacy rate than the United States. In Barbados, educating children is not a problem. 300 students took the SAT, that's the exam you must take to go to college in the United States. They all scored well above average. All the children who took the test were black. All the children who took the test were poor. How come being poor and black is not an obstacle to achieving at high levels in Barbados? What would happen if that occurred in Australia? What would the results reveal? To what degree are the backgrounds of your children dictating their outcomes? The answer to that question has everything to do with our leadership and the kinds of schools that we're in. It also has a lot to do with the kinds of policies we pursue. And policy is a problem, and I think many of us realize today that education is highly political. I'll come back to that in a moment. The big problem, though, is also within the schools themselves. Because in too many schools, there's a complacency about the patterns. There's a tendency to rationalize it, isn't there? Say, oh, well, the reason why these kids don't do well is because their family, their parents don't value education. Have you ever heard that one? Or the reason why they don't do so well is their children themselves. They watch too much television. They're too distracted, or they're hungry. In Spanish, we call that the pobrecito syndrome. Poor little child, he's hungry, he doesn't get enough to eat. Pity. Pity is not the same as empathy, though. Schools that are motivated by empathy don't make excuses for poverty, because poverty is not a learning disability. Schools that are motivated by empathy find ways to mitigate the effects of poverty, to address them, while they simultaneously challenge and stimulate and provoke and disturb the children, just like that museum did last night. Maybe not the same ways, but. I would say that unless we are willing to challenge our staff to shake things up so that there is not a predictability to the patterns, then we are implicated in reproducing the problem ourselves. And a lot of leaders don't like to be disruptors. It's far easier to be the nice guy, the nice lady, the nice one who just is very collegial, who just gets along with everyone, who even when we see a classroom that we know we would not put our own child in, ignores what we see, because those are other people's children. I would say this, a lot would change right now in education if we simply said that the schools must be good enough for our own children. Because you know who's most suspicious about education and least trusting of schools? Educators with their own children. I know very few educators who just send their kids to school and say, I don't care what school it is, they're all fine. I don't care which teacher you get, they're all good. You can trust it. Most educators I know are very, very careful, very thoughtful in the way they approach it. I am. And because I have power and influence, I'm able to make sure that my children get into good schools, good classrooms. I have the time, I have the resources, the know-how to make that happen, but many of the parents that you serve don't, do they? In fact, many of the parents we serve trust us too much. That's hard to hear, isn't it? Because they're not watching. They're not scrutinizing. They're not critiquing. They're just sending us the kids and hoping for the best. They're working too hard or whatever they're doing. They're distracted. They're counting on us to do the job. So my question then falls back on you. What are you doing to make sure those children receive an excellent education? You know, when I hear the song we sang up here, "We are excellent, you are excellent," it's inspiring. But if that's really the message, that we believe that all of our children are capable of excellence, then we have to create schools that are designed to cultivate excellence in children, regardless of the backgrounds. And again, doing that requires that we disrupt the patterns, challenge the assumptions, break the stereotypes, engage the parents, because we can't do it without them. Know the community, because children don't live in our schools, they live in communities. That's the adaptive work. And if we're not doing the adaptive work, we're doing the technical work, then chances are we're going to rationalize the patterns and rationalize the predictability. And I want to say I see lots of well-meaning educators do it all the time. I was visiting a school in California, Northern California, being given a tour of the school by the assistant principal, who was very proud of the renovations that were done, the new library, the new computer lab. We get to his office, there's a little boy about 7 or 8 years old waiting for him. And he turns to me and says, "You know, there's a prison cell in San Quentin waiting for that boy right now." I said, "Really?" I said, "How do you know that?" He says, "Well, he's a hellraiser. He's always in trouble. His father's in prison, his older brother's in prison, and I can tell by the way he behaves that that's where he's going to end up." So then I turn and ask him, "Well, what is your school doing to keep him out of prison?" And he looks at me perplexed and puzzled because he doesn't think that's his job. In fact, what he was about to do was to suspend this boy for 30 days, the longest suspension possible, send the work home to his sick grandmother, who they knew could not supervise him, and effectively wash their hands. Now, you should know the boy was African American, the assistant principal was African American. This is about how systems operate. It doesn't matter who's in the system unless those in the system are willing and able to disrupt the system. Because the process is not simply about how we conform and whether we conform, although that's a big part of it. It's about our whole economy and the way it works, about the way our institutions work. And they will continue to work in those ways unless we challenge them, unless we disrupt them, unless we question them. And so I want to encourage you to do the adaptive work, and I want to encourage you to ask yourself, what am I going to do to challenge my own staff? And I realize, again, it's hard to do that. So many schools I go to have a phony sense of egalitarianism. We pretend we're all okay, we're all professionals. But we know very well I would never put my child in your classroom. We know very well that person should have stopped teaching a long time ago because he's burnt out. Or that person is unstable. Or that person is disorganized and not prepared. And unless we're willing to engage each other, to have the hard conversations, then what happens? Nothing changes. And so adaptive work is hard. But I would say, unless we're doing the adaptive work, then we're going to be implicated in the reproduction. So a few key principles to keep in mind. One I already mentioned, that poverty is not a learning disability. I come from a poor family. Neither of my parents graduated from high school. They sent all 6 of us to universities. We grew up in an area called Brownsville, Brooklyn, better known for producing boxers like Mike Tyson and rappers like Biggie Smalls. My brother went to Harvard, I went to Brown, another brother went to Cornell, 2 at Berkeley. All living proof your background doesn't have to determine what you can accomplish. Even though my parents didn't have formal education, they believed in education. They used to make us go to the libraries on Saturdays after we did our chores. And I was lucky because there was a librarian there named Miss McDonald who had an uncanny ability to identify books she thought you would like. fourth grade, I read a book called A Wrinkle in Time. A book I would have never picked because I thought I hated science fiction, and I was the type of child that judged a book by its cover. I didn't like the cover, but I trusted Miss McDonald. I loved the book. Came back a week later and said, I'm ready for some more. I became an avid reader because of Mrs. McDonald. What are we doing to build a love of learning in our children? What are we doing to create a desire to learn in our kids? A desire to learn that extends beyond the test, that goes through the summer, well past graduation, that continues well through adulthood. Because we know that our democracy depends on it, doesn't it? People who continue to read, who continue to seek out information, who don't just believe what they're told, but have the ability to critique and recognize lies when they're being fed them. Who have the ability to look at problems and not just shrink back and run away and turn back on MTV, if you have MTV, but instead are willing and able to think creatively about how to address them. So I want to encourage you to find ways to challenge the stereotypes, to find ways to organize your schools to meet the needs of your children, rather than expecting your children to adjust the way your school's been organized. In many secondary schools especially, but you see it sometimes in elementary schools, that teachers expect the children to learn the way they teach. If the children can't do it, then it's the child's fault. In the best schools, the schools I'll describe in a moment, the teachers teach the way the children learn. They adapt to the needs of the child, rather than expecting the child to adapt to them. They teach like coaches. They teach like music teachers. Think about the way these gentlemen, Frank Bansel, got us singing in 45 minutes? Now, I like to sing. I'm a bathroom singer, though. I don't sing much in public because my kids don't let me. But he got us singing. He got us harmonizing. He got us engaged. People who teach music, who teach sports, who teach theater, understand that when you're focused on performance, it's not good enough to simply cover the material. You have to actually look, can they do it? Do they get it? Do they understand it? And if they don't, then they have to do it again and again till they get it right. We have to model for them how to do it. Get your teachers to teach like coaches. Get your teachers to teach like Bransel. Because I would say that if we focus on performance, if we focus on the learning, we will teach differently. I'll come back to that in a moment, too. I've been focusing my work for the last several years on the issue of equity. Equity is not the same as equality. Equality is about treating everyone the same. Equity is about understanding that our children are not the same. They're all different. Different temperament, different personalities. Even in the same family, there are differences, no? I have 5 children, they're all different. I was talking to a group of educators recently. A woman said she had identical twins with huge differences. Said you could tell the differences in the first words they speak. One, his first word was snuggle. The second one's first word was jump. Said everything about their differences in identical twins. My first child walked at 9 months. I was very proud, as if I had something to do with it. The fourth one didn't walk till 15 months. I was very concerned. I thought she'd crawl forever. They all walk fine now, though. Even when you don't achieve average yearly progress in walking or reading or talking, it's not a prediction for how well you'll do later. Equity is about giving children what they need to be successful. I would say most parents practice equity with their own children. When I was walking my third and fourth child to school, they're a year apart, the fourth one, who was more gregarious, would give me a kiss goodbye and say, "Daddy, I'm off." She'd want to play with her friends. Her older brother would want to hold my hand longer because he was shy. I didn't hold his hand longer because I loved him more. I just knew he needed more time. You have children in your school sometimes who need more time, don't you? Don't they? They don't get it as fast. Or who need more patience. Or who arrive at school unhappy because they got beat at home that morning. So they're angry. And they're too young to even explain why they're angry. We can't simply focus on the academic needs and ignore the social and emotional needs in our children, can we? Equity is about recognizing the needs are complex. It's about recognizing, like a pediatrician, that child development is driving some of the outcomes. And any pediatrician will tell you there's a spectrum in which children do things, from walking to talking to reading to riding a bike or swimming. Our schools need to be developmentally focused. I hope that's still the case in Australia. It's increasingly not the case in the United States, because we're so focused narrowly on achievement that we're testing 5-year-olds, even want to test 4-year-olds, and taking away all the discovery, all the exploration that used to be part of learning. You know, in the United States, it used to be common for every kindergarten classroom to have a piano and for the teacher to know how to play it. Because for the longest time, we understood that music was a foundation for learning, that children respond to music. They still do, don't they? But in the United States, music is now seen as an extra that gets cut as soon as the budget gets tight, like art. We'll double up the math and double up the literacy and take away the art, the science, the music, the recess even. I hope you don't do that here in Australia. I saw a study recently that said that eating lunch was good for test scores, and I said, thank God. But they might take lunch too. But we don't do that to privileged children, do we? They get art, they get music, they get the well-rounded education. We only do that to poor children in the name of achievement, ignoring everything we do about child development. If we drew on the research in neuroscience, the research that's telling us that the brain is not fixed, but elastic, that it responds to stimulation, it responds to contact, to strong, positive relationships, then instead of measuring and sorting, we would see every child as a puzzle. Every child is an opportunity to develop new gifts, new talents, to figure out how do we stimulate, how do we challenge this child, how do we develop their abilities, recognizing they're not all the same, they may not all do things in the same ways. But the research from the neuroscience is very powerful, showing us that the learning that occurs during infancy can actually continue throughout a person's lifetime, even well into adulthood, with the right stimulation. Equity is about providing that to children. And finally, equity is also about understanding who those children are socially, what their lives are like outside of school, what the challenges are that they face. Because if we don't know about who they are socially, we won't know how to engage them. Or we may only see their deficits and not be able to see their strengths. What the research shows now on resilience, resilience is critical for poor children, for children who face hardships. And resilience is the byproduct of confidence and competence. You need both to become resilient, to persevere, to learn to overcome obstacles and not give up. We have to know who our children are. We have to understand the communities that we work in. We have to have allies in those communities so that our communities see us as an ally and we in turn have partners that we can work with to meet the needs of our kids, because in too many of our communities, the schools can't do it alone. They simply can't. The needs are too great. And so if we're armed with a more holistic, more integrated vision of our children in our schools, then we will approach it differently. But I want to acknowledge that our policies make this work hard. And my hunch is that Australia is following the same pattern as the United States. I know that because I read. And I know that, like the United States, the narrow approach to education is dominant. Right now, we use pressure as a strategy for improving schools. Apply threats. Label schools as failing schools or high-performing schools, overlooking that so often that's about the demographics of the children. We focus narrowly on achievement, ignore the social needs of children, the emotional needs. We use the test scores to rank children, and by extension now their teachers and the schools. We adopt scripted curriculum, teacher-proof curriculum. I hope they don't do that here in Australia, but in the United States we believe the teachers are the problem. So we want teacher-proof schools. We want to hold principals accountable, so we adopt laws like Race for the Top, where we'd say fire the principal, even though there's no principal to replace them. We say still fire the principal. Makes absolutely no sense. But these is both the Obama and the Bush administration who endorsed the same policies. We use a punitive approach to discipline where we focus on humiliation and exclusion, and almost always end up punishing the kids with the greatest disadvantage the most. And we encourage competition among schools. So schools are competing for resources, competing for children under the guise of choice. Now there's another way, another approach. We call this the broad approach. And it's evident in a few places. I'm going to describe some of those places. Evident in Finland, for example, as a nation. In those places, it's a focus on learning conditions. It's a focus on using assessment to diagnose learning abilities, not merely to rank children. It's focused on developing teacher skills continuously, because teachers don't graduate from school master teachers. Focus on the whole child, health, nutrition, safety, on holding all stakeholders accountable. Students, teachers, parents, legislators, prime ministers, since they're the ones making the decisions. Treating parents as partners, not consumers. Using discipline to build character and to address the underlying causes behind the behavior problems. Expanding learning opportunities into the summer, after school. And promoting cooperation among schools, so schools are learning from each other rather than competing. Now, I would argue that where you see that broad approach in place, you're also seeing equity in place. And you're seeing schools where the backgrounds of children are not driving the outcomes. I'm going to describe some of those schools in a moment because they exist. This is not a pipe dream. They're focused on these things that I mentioned, but they're also focused on, I'm going the wrong way, that's what's happening here. They're focused on inspiring the people around them, rather than using pressure and fear. Right? Pressure and fear is what's driving our policies now. I would say that for kids who already know a lot of failure, fear of failure is not going to work. They actually need to be inspired. They need a sense of hope, a sense of possibility. We have a lot of evidence already that the strategy we're using isn't working. I want to, if Chris can work with me, that short video.
Hello.
A short video to illustrate what I see as part of the problem.
Hello. Welcome to Energy Conservation Incorporated.
Thank you. I really hope to get a job here.
Well, let's get started with your interview. What do you think are your greatest strengths?
My greatest strengths.
Yes, your greatest strengths.
What are my answer choices?
What do you mean?
My answer choices. You know, A, B, C, or D.
There are not any answer choices.
Oh, I understand. In that case, I choose C.
You choose C?
Yes, I choose C. My 5th grade teacher told me to always choose C when I did not know the answer.
Oh, it sounds like your 5th grade teacher really prepared you for your future. Moving on then. This job will require you to write proposals about energy conservation. Are you a strong writer?
Yes. My teachers always told me that I write very good stories. I also like to write poetry.
Well, we will not need you to write poetry or stories. We will need you to write proposals regarding energy conservation.
Proposals. Is that like writing a persuasive essay?
Sure.
In that case, yes. I am very good at writing proposals. Every year in school, my teachers made me write a proposal regarding school uniform policies. I also wrote some proposals about banning cell phones in school. Would you like to read them?
No, I would not like to read them. If you get a job here, you will need to write proposals about energy conservation. Your proposals will need to include basic mathematical equations as well as scientific research.
Wait.
What is wrong?
I am confused.
That is not very surprising.
You said I would have to include mathematical equations and scientific research in my writing.
Yes, that is what I said.
But that doesn't make sense.
What doesn't make sense?
Math, science, and writing. They are separate subjects. I don't know if I can incorporate math and science into my writing. They are all very different.
Well, if you work here, that is what you will have to do.
This job seems very difficult. I do not think my public education prepared me to work here.
Well, I have to agree with you. I have one more question for you though. Why did you think you were ever qualified to work here in the first place? Why are you looking around?
You asked me a question, and I do not know the answer. So, I am looking for someone to think pair share with.
There is no one for you to think pair share with.
Oh. In that case, I choose C.
I think I've heard enough. Thank you for coming in.
I don't know if that resonates here in Australia at all. The United States, it does. We have lots and lots of evidence that children who are passing our standardized tests are completely unprepared for university-level work. Can't write, can't think independently, can't critique, can't do the kinds of things that you would expect an educated person to do. And so I think for a number of reasons we've got to rethink what we've been doing, and I realize that sometimes that puts you at risk with policy because our policies are driving us in a different direction. We have, I'd say, focused too narrowly on achievement over the last few years. In the United States, they tried an experiment a few years ago. It was launched by an economist at Harvard, Roland Fryer, who was given several $1 million by the Broad Foundation to pay children to get higher test scores. The theory was that monetary incentives would lead to growth. And they tried this experiment in New York, Chicago, Dallas, Washington, D.C. And after 2 years, they came to the conclusion it wasn't working. Showed no evidence of gains, the kind of gains they thought. And some people debated maybe need to pay them more. And at the time I was debating, Roland Fryer said it makes no sense in the first place because how many children will you pay? How long will you pay them? And what's more, you're not even looking at the places where children are achieving and not being paid and asking what are they doing differently. Well, on the day that the experiment results were announced in the New York Times, it also happened to be the day that the death of Jaime Escalante was announced. Jaime Escalante was a Bolivian engineer who decided to leave engineering to teach calculus at Garfield High School in Los Angeles. And Escalante had the nerve to believe that poor Latino children, the children of factory workers and custodians, could do advanced placement calculus, the most rigorous course offered in our secondary schools. The first people to oppose him were his colleagues, the teachers who said, not these children, they can't do that level work. He said, watch me. And he proceeded to get his kids to take these tests, and they excelled. In fact, they did so well that they, of course, assumed they must have cheated. So they sent investigators in to require the kids to be retested, and they passed it yet again, and they passed for several years in a row. So they sent in researchers to try to understand what was Escalante doing to get his kids to pass this test. And in each case, the researchers came back and said, we don't see anything unusual here, it's just math. Because they didn't understand what Escalante called teaching ganas. If you speak Spanish, you would know that ganas is the desire to learn. How did he impart the desire to learn in poor children who didn't speak English as their first language? Well, he first of all took them to places where calculus is used, like aeronautical labs and space laboratories. He said, these are the places that use calculus in the workplace, because he had to expand their horizons. He had to challenge the stereotypes, because most of those kids only knew their neighborhoods. Then he challenged them culturally. He said, you know, you are the descendants of people who built pyramids. Calculus is in your heritage. And then he challenged their parents. Got their parents to prioritize the learning over working, because many of these children came from families where the families depended upon the children to work to support the family, which was leading to high dropout rates, leading to children choose work over college. So we had the funeral for Escalante, and there was this great outpouring of his former students, many of whom were now doctors and lawyers and engineers and teachers. I met one of his former students who was now a superintendent in Southern California. And she was saying, everything you've heard about Escalante is true. He was dedicated, he was committed, he pushed us, he drove us. She said, he used to come to my soccer games. I said, he would come to cheer you on? He said, no, he didn't come to cheer me on. He came to criticize me and told me I couldn't play soccer. I should go back to math. One teacher changed the lives of hundreds of kids. One teacher. Imagine what happens when a whole school is organized to change lives. We heard the band leader say, the band is greater than the sum of its parts. Great schools are greater than the sum of their parts, because they have more power when they're organized around a common vision. That's adaptive leadership too. Great schools don't focus on achievement, they focus on engagement. They focus on getting kids excited about learning, because it's easier to teach kids who are invested as learners than it is to teach passive learners. Children who are there in body but not in mind. Schools that are focused on engagement realize that engagement is multidimensional. It's behavioral, so you can see it, you know if they show up, you know if they're prepared, but it's also cognitive. You can tell the types of questions they ask. You can look at the work and see if they understand the material. And it is emotional. They work hard because they care. They work hard because they believe it's important. I would say this, if you have the faith, if you have the courage, start the school year by telling your teachers, don't focus on achievement anymore. Focus on getting your kids excited about learning. Focus on getting them to believe and understand that knowledge is power. Get them to see it, get them to experience it, so that they become invested as learners. I'll tell you this, if you can do that, their jobs will get easier. Here's a school also in East Los Angeles. Look at the classroom. It's a 90-minute math class. And the kids are up out of their seats. And they're learning from each other. That they are in control of the learning. In fact, the teacher's so good, she can stand in the back and talk to me. If she wanted to, she could do yoga. She doesn't have to hover, because the children know exactly what to do. They're learning together, they're learning from each other. So she becomes the facilitator of learning. She becomes able to differentiate support to her students. And guess what? There's no discipline problem. Because the highest form of classroom management is what? It is academic engagement. And despite the fact that these kids come from a very poor community and most of them don't speak English as the first language, they are doing high-level work. She's a master teacher at work. Now, my son is also in that picture. He's in the khakis. He was with a program called City Year that does community service in schools, and so he was working as a tutor in the school. He told me about this teacher, said she's one of the best teachers. And after that class, I said, well, I was impressed. She's excellent. He said, but she's not the best. I said, how do you know? He said, the kids told me about another one. He's better. You ever want to know who the best teachers are? Ask your children. They'll tell you. So we go to see, I said, I want to see the best one then. We go to his classroom. He's got a drum set at the front of the room. I said, what's he doing with the drum set? He said, I don't know. Let's watch. We watch and see. It's like the Tonight Show. It is using music to keep the kids engaged. Music and rhythm. It is full participation. It is like what we went through in learning that song, except it's every day in a language arts class. He understands that when you're working with 12-year-olds, learning needs to be fun. And because learning is fun, they are willing participants in their own education, and not just the advanced students, all the students. He said there are kids who cut their other classes to go to his class. Our kids actually expect to be challenged, you know. Like it when they're challenged. Like it when they're pushed, especially by caring teachers. So we need to motivate our kids not by fear, but by higher goals. By a recognition that we can use education to confront the obstacles in their lives. Education is not about something else. Education can be applied to understand what's going on around us. Education can be used to draw upon the knowledge they bring, because we don't teach children with empty heads. They come to us with knowledge and experience that we can tap and utilize. We have to understand who they are, though. We have to understand their challenges, their dreams, their aspirations, and we have to help them to understand how knowledge can be used. I saw this so clearly at a school in Oakland, California. School I was asked to work with by the superintendent because the school had low test scores. And the superintendent was at a loss for what to do. He said, Pedro, could you go and visit this school and help me to figure out what to do? So I go to speak to the teachers, and all the teachers want to talk to me is about is discipline. How unruly and disruptive the children are. That's all I hear, a whole litany about the terrible things the children do. So after a while of hearing this, I said, let me ask you a question. Suppose you were going to teach in a foreign country. What would you want to know before you taught in that country? And they don't know why I'm asking the question, but they play along. And they say, well, you need to know something about the history, about politics, about the economy, about culture. I said, why do you need to know those things? I said, because unless you understand the context, you won't be effective as a teacher. I said, well, how many of these things do you know about the community where you work? Do you know about its history? Do you know if there are parks? Do you know where people buy food? Do you know what people do for a living here? Do you know basic things about life in this community? And most of the teachers didn't know. All they knew was the reputation, that it was a bad neighborhood. Kind of neighborhood they wanted to get out of as faster than the kids. At the end of the day, they were in their cars before the kids were out of the school. So because I'd set them up, they said they need to know, and they didn't know. I said, let's do a field trip. Let's do a tour of the community. We got in a bus, and we went into the neighborhoods, and we went to the supermarkets, we went to the libraries, went to the parks, went by the apartments where the kids live, even saw some children who waved at their teachers. I thought I'd done a great job. We came back to the school, and every teacher, with the exception of one, said the same thing. They said they felt uncomfortable. They said people were staring at them. They felt like tourists in a strange place. One of them said, I thought you were going to help us. You're taking us on field trips. But one teacher, a relatively new teacher, said, I saw something interesting. I said, what's that? She said, I noticed that many of the homes in this area have gardens in the backyard. I said, well, why is that interesting? She said, well, this is an industrial area, and they may not realize that the soil is toxic, contaminated with lead, and if people are eating vegetables from those gardens, they're probably contaminated with lead. So people are looking at her. I said, well, what do you want to do with that information? She said, I teach environmental science. I think I can incorporate that into one of my units. So the older teachers in the group are looking at her like, who's Miss Smarty Pants over here? Where'd she come from? But I decide I'm going to visit her in her class, and I watch this unit unfold, and she explains how the lead goes from the atmosphere into the soil, from the soil into the plants, and what happens when it's in the dust and in the food people eat, particularly in small children. And then she goes a step further, and she gets these kits that allow children to test the soil for lead content and other contaminants. And the children go out into their community and begin mapping the community based on how toxic the soil is, and they produce maps of their neighborhood. And they start to see the patterns, and they see that where there were foundries and where there were factories and gas stations, the soil is more toxic. And they produce this report on the dangers of lead, and it's the whole time this is taking place, there's never a disruption. So the unit is over. Teacher and I are both pleased by the engagement of the students. And then she says, okay, we've got to move on to the next unit. One of our students raises his hand and says, we can't move on. She says, why not? He says, because now we have to warn the people. She says, warn the people? She looks at me, Pedro, how do I warn the people? I said, I don't know how to warn the people either. But I do know the county health commissioner. So together we go the next day to see the county health commissioner and describe what the class has done, the research they've done, bring the report to him, and he's shocked because the only thing he's ever heard about this school is how bad the children are, how poorly it does. He said, your children are doing this kind of scientific research? He said, yes. These are 12-year-olds. He said, I'd like to come and hear them talk about the research. He said, we'd be happy to have you. So he comes. You know what the highest form of learning is? Teaching someone else what you've done. So the children are there explaining the research, and they're shining because they're able to explain their maps. They're able to explain how the lead is affecting the children, affecting the community. He listens, and then when they're finished, he says, look, I'm going to send out a notice to every household in this area, warning them about the lead in the soil and the air, and I will offer any family that wants it free topsoil. And the children cheer. What did they really learn from this? I would say they learned a lot more than science. They learned a lot more than what they typically get out of an environmental studies class, because what they really learned is that the knowledge that they were engaged with could actually lead to transforming their communities. When we talk about education as a form of empowerment, education is only empowering if, in fact, it makes these kinds of connections. If it helps us to understand the world we live in, it helps us to understand how to solve those problems. So education has to engage. We can't simply be focused on standards and not focused on how to prepare young people to live in the world today. That kind of education forces us to do this adaptive work. And so I want to encourage you to be willing to cultivate the passion for teaching in your teachers, which means reminding them that teaching is intellectual work. If they're not learning, if they're not stimulated, they won't be able to stimulate the children. If they are not focused on how to engage and how to build relationships with those children, then they will have children who will choose not to learn from them. How many of you have seen children that will choose not to learn from one teacher, but they're fine with another? Children learn through relationships. Teaching teachers how to build relationships, particularly across language, race, class, is essential if we want to see better outcomes. These teachers are constantly looking for evidence, and one of the things they do that's different is they treat every assignment produced by a student as a first draft. First draft because we don't do our best work on the first draft, do we? I don't. The real learning is in the revision, not the first submission. And the real teaching is in the feedback, not the grading. Think again about how you learn a video game. Trial and error. The error is part of the learning and needs to be incorporated into the learning. We also need to model for our kids what good work looks like. And on that basis, ask for the revision. I do that with my doctoral students at New York University. I do that, have done that for years, and I see teachers who are teaching in this way model for students what's expected so they understand what excellence looks like. I would say we also need to show our other teachers what excellent teaching is. Make it transparent, because too many of our teachers are teaching in isolation. They're working hard, but they're not working effectively. And they have never seen someone who knows how to engage, who knows how to empower learners. And we've got to find ways to make that more accessible and more available to our teachers. So what does it look like when it all comes together? Well, this is the story of PS 28 in Brooklyn. Now, in New York City, we have very fancy names for our schools. Public School 28 is in Bedford-Stuyvesant. And the woman featured in that picture is Sadie Silver. Sadie Silver was the principal of that school. She contacted me and said, Pedro, I need you to come visit my school, and I want you to see what we're doing. And it was hard for me to get there because it was way out in Brooklyn. It was actually the part of Brooklyn I grew up in. So I do eventually get there. When I get there, the first person introduced me to is her secretary. She said, I want you to meet the person who does all the administrative work. She's a super secretary. So I said, well, that's great. I said, then what do you do? She said, I'm the lead teacher. I didn't become a principal to escape the classroom. She said, come, let's go to classrooms. And we go into classrooms, and in every classroom we visit, I'm seeing 4 and 5 adults. I said, where do you get all these teachers? She said, well, they're not all teachers. Our special education teachers work hand in hand with the regular ed. Kids can't tell the difference. They work as a team. 30% of our students who are identified as having special needs. I said, who are the others? She said, those are parents we train. They don't get paid, but they get trained to assist teachers. And some of them just make copies, and some of them work individually with kids. I see one parent, she's standing very close to a little boy. I said, why is she so close to that boy? She says, well, she's there to keep him calm, and we're glad she's here. He has trouble sitting still. See the little boy raise his hand, the teacher just looks at him and nods. He gets up out of his seat to go use the restroom. Within a couple minutes, he's back. I said, I'm so impressed. She said, why? I said, I don't see guards. I see the boy went to the bathroom. He didn't get distracted. He came right back. A lot of schools going to the bathroom is a big issue. She laughed. She said, my kids have to walk on the most dangerous streets in New York City every day. If I can't teach them to use the bathroom responsibly, I have failed as a principal. That's part of her standards. She explains that her school works through a series of partnerships. She has a partnership with the local hospital. They provide an optometrist, a doctor who makes regular visits. Kids get immunizations at the school, a nurse. It's a full functioning clinic at the school for children and families. She has another partnership with the job training agency in the area. They provide parents who wanted job training classes so they can complete their secondary education, because she believes that if the parents are educated and employed, they'll do a better job with their children. Yet another partnership with the YMCA. The YMCA provides the second shift at the school because 30% of her students are homeless. That means they're in shelters. That means that typically in a school like that, there will be a very high transience rate. Except at her school, 95% of the children who start will end the year at that school. Even when parents have to take an extra bus to get there, they're willing to do it because they know their children are getting something good. The YMCA makes sure the school is open till 6 o'clock at night so children aren't on the streets in the cold. And after school, they're getting enrichment, they're getting music, they're getting robotics, they're getting chess. She says, let me show you the professional development I have going on for my teachers today. Takes me to a room, and there are 2 social workers meeting with 8 teachers on how to respond to the social and emotional needs of children. And teachers are presenting the problems they see with the kids. One teacher says, I have a child who's aggressive. He's fighting other kids. Another one says, he's got a child who's depressed and withdrawn. Another one's got a child he said he has attachment issues. He's attached to my leg and I can't teach. And in each case, the social workers are giving them very tangible, practical suggestions for how to address the needs of the children. So I turned to Sadie. I said, what made you decide to offer this as a form of professional development for your teachers? She said, until I did, my teachers were referring too many of our children to special education. She said, my teachers have to be more skilled to work at this school. This is part of their training. She said, let me introduce you to my guidance counselor. And we walked down the hall. She said, I have to warn you, I got him from the rubber room. Now, if you're not from New York City, you may not have ever heard of the rubber room, but the rubber room is a place where teachers who've done something wrong are sent. They get paid, but they just sit there. They can do crossword puzzles. They can read books, but they can't teach children. And some of them are there for years. It's a terrible thing. I said, how do you know to get this man from the rubber room? She said, I don't know why he was in the first place. But he had been my guidance counselor when I was in school, and he literally saved my life. So I knew he was good. So I requested him, and they said, you can have him. They gave him to me. I don't even have to pay a salary. And there he is, and he's sitting down talking to a little boy, so I introduced myself to both of them. And I asked the little boy, why are you here today? He said, I'm here to learn how to be good. So I said, well, is it working? He says, I hope so, because I'm tired of being sent out of class. And then the guidance counselor explains that the school has a no suspension policy, no exclusion policy. They don't believe sending children home to watch television is an effective intervention. So they really do focus on character, on teaching the child how to conduct himself. So I'm so impressed by what I'm seeing, I said, I'm going to have to tell the chancellor of schools, who at the time was Joel Klein, about what I've seen at your school. He said, well, if you're going to contact the chancellor, I've got to take you to see one more thing. She takes me to her office. And her office is set up like a classroom with desks and chairs and a large round table. I said, what happens here? She said, I told you I was a lead teacher. I work with the children the teachers struggle with. All day long, I'm doing interventions with those children. And then she shows me that every child in the school has a portfolio where they keep their work. And they're monitoring every single student because every child has an educational plan. Nothing is left to chance. So when I found out that this school, despite the demographics, had the highest gains in literacy and math, I had to write to the chancellor. I said, you need to go visit PS 28. 3 days later, he did. Joel Klein went to see the school, and he was so impressed, he wrote about it to every principal in New York City. That's 1,800 principals in New York City, because we have 1.1 million children. Except the only thing he mentioned in his letter was the data system she was using. Because New York City had just spent $100 million on that data system. He's glad to see someone using it. So I wrote back to him and said, Joel, I'm so glad you visited the school, but you missed it, because it's not just the data system that gets those results. And that's the problem, isn't it? A lot of times the policymakers don't get it, don't see it, don't realize that it's all those things that have to come together to allow us to reach the children. So if you could do that in Bedford-Stuyvesant, I think you could do that anywhere in Australia. They're doing it in Brockton, Massachusetts. Brockton, Massachusetts is the largest high school in the state of Massachusetts, over 4,000 children. It's the only urban high school in the state that gets a level 1 rating by the state. All the other level 1 rated schools are in wealthy areas. You know what the secret to their success is? Every teacher at Brockton is a teacher of literacy. Whether they teach science or math or history or music, everyone's teaching literacy. And they've been doing it now for 14 years, and over 1/3 of their class gets the highest possible score on the test. And what's amazing about that is not only do they get a free scholarship to any public university in the state because of it, but the demographics of the scholarship winners matches the demographics of the school. 1/3 African American, 1/3 Latino, 1/3 low-income white. It's a school where the backgrounds of the kids don't predict the outcomes. Equity is real. It shows up in all kinds of places when there's a commitment to make it happen. So I want to encourage you to change the conversation at your school. Instead of focusing on achievement, focus on getting kids excited about learning. Tap into the creative part of teaching again. Instead of focusing on accountability, we've got to build systems of mutual accountability where parents, teachers, students, everyone understands their role, eventually the politicians as well. We've got to focus on evidence, but we need to make sure the evidence of learning is authentic, that the kids really do understand how to use and apply knowledge. And lastly, we've got to make sure that we're creating schools where the backgrounds of our kids don't predict their outcomes. We know this to be true. Not everything that counts can be measured. And not everything that counts, that can be counted, counts. I just reversed it, sorry for that. But you get the point. Our policymakers don't get it. But you do know that sometimes a child needs a hug because they haven't gotten one. Sometimes the children need to sing because it'll lift their spirits. Sometimes the teacher needs a note and a Snickers bar because that bit of acknowledgement might be what it takes to keep that teacher going. The morale of your teachers will impact the results of your children. I've never seen a high-performing school where the adults don't work hard. And that's not about the contract. So I want to encourage you to do the adaptive work. I want to encourage you to create schools that defy the patterns. And let me close with this because Bob is waiting for me to finish and tell you a story about yet another PS. This one is 138 in the South Bronx on Willis Avenue. It's the part of the Bronx that burned in the 1970s. It burned because the landlords thought it was easier to burn the property than to repair it, so it looked like a war zone. My grandmother lived on Willis Avenue in the housing projects across the street from 138. And the children who go to 138 live in those projects too. Those projects have full of problems, gangs, drugs, all kinds of horrible issues. But PS 138 is a high-performing school. So when I heard it was a high-performing school in the South Bronx, I said, I got to go visit. So I arranged a visit. I'm greeted by a fourth-grade girl. She says, I'm your tour guide. I said, okay, let's go. And she takes me and she shows me the awards the school's won, the articles written up about the school, because it's been distinguished for many years now. She takes me to the library and explains there's an ongoing competition for who reads the most books. I said, what do they get? They get pizza on a Friday. That's what they get. They don't get paid. There's artwork on the walls. There's student work on the walls. Students publish a newsletter with their original work. There's plants on display. It's immaculate. I tell the little girl, I'm so impressed. She said, well, let me take you upstairs. It's more impressive. So I'm wondering what I'm going to see upstairs. And I learned that the only museum in New York City dedicated to the history of the Bronx is in their school. But it's not locked away in a classroom. It's in the hallways. So the first thing you see is a picture of a Bronx family, a German family, spelled their name with a K, not an X. Owned a large farm there. See a picture of Joe Louis when he fought Max Schmeling at Yankee Stadium. See a picture of the Yankees from the 1920s. See the first album produced by Donald Byrd, the jazz artist, encased in glass, and his student Willie Colon. There's all kinds of memorabilia on display, all within easy reach of children. So the first thing that comes to my mind is that this could easily be vandalized, it could be stolen. So I turn to the little girl and I ask, aren't they worried that the kids might damage or break some of this? And she turns to me and looks at me like I'm some kind of sicko. And she says, I don't know about the schools you go to normally, but the children at this school know how to take care of things. Ask yourself now, could we have a museum in our school? Would our children know how to take care of things? Do they have that sense of pride? Do they have that sense of hope? Do they understand that this school is the source of opportunity for the future? If you could do that in the South Bronx, you can do that anywhere in this country. I hope you will. Thank you.